Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Plan B Success. Today, I'd like to take you back and talk about WeWork, the erstwhile most valuable company in the world a couple of weeks ago, not so much anymore. That's the company that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about their recent IPO debacle and what exactly happened there and what can we look forward to in the future in terms of resurrecting the company. Let's look at the history of WeWork just so that we get perspective of what we're talking about. Adam Neumann, the founder and CEO of WeWork, was born in Israel, moved to the US in 2001 after serving as a naval officer in the Israel military, and had an interesting venture before he launched WeWork. Before he started WeWork, he owned a baby clothing company called Crawlers. This was based out of Brooklyn, and what he did was he had clothes for kids with padded knees for crawling babies. He did okay with this venture for a while, and at the same time, in the same building that he had this venture, was his later to be co founder, Miguel Michelwi, who was an architect at a small firm in that same building. So together, they decided that they were going to open up a co working space for other entrepreneurs to work in. And what they did is they ended up talking to their landlord of that building, and after much deliberation, they opened up the first floor of that building as their startup. And it was called Green Desk, and this was back in 2008. And their goal at that point in time was to make sure that they featured all recycled furniture and the electricity came from wind power, everything around being green. And they did that for a while. Then they eventually sold that business, I think in about a year, back to their landlord. They probably made some money off of that. And then in 2010, they founded and launched WeWork. Now, WeWork is basically a co-working spaces company, a real estate company where they were trying to create a community, create a space to work for entrepreneurs that would come equipped with amenities like free beer, stocked fridges, game tables, etc. As we all know, a lot of startups are in that kind of an atmosphere, and eventually that's who they targeted. And at a later point in time, even large well-known firms started making a beeline for WeWork's offices. Now the question is, they tried to portray WeWork as a tech company, whereas honestly it was a company that leased large floors and spaces at low rates, hopefully, from landlords and then sublet them back to entrepreneurs and these other people, even for short-term leases, and try to make money as a result of that. Now, the membership, as I said, is very diversified. It was multiple industries, and it started growing pretty well too. So this was about affordable space, a community, a network, flexibility, services, etc. That was the bottom line of all the offerings that WeWork brought to the fore. Now, in its early days, WeWork started as one office space in the Soho neighborhood of New York City. And in fact, I think even today, New York and some other cities in the US are where their most number of offices are. Their website talks about 743 co-working sites open or coming soon in about 124 cities in more than 36 countries. You can see that they expanded pretty rapidly from 2010 to where we are today. They had a huge influx of injection of funds coming in from multiple parties, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And they are roughly around 12,000 employees as to date. Now, the best part about their growth is the insistence of Neumann that he was out to build something really large, big, and lucrative. Now, there are hundreds of co-working companies out there in the world. There are many in the US itself, but none as distinguished as WeWork because of the amount of media publicity it got, at the same time the insistence of Neumann in terms of attracting the money from investors, never heard of sums in terms of growing that company. And when we look at WeWork today as a company, it's a whole mix and match of several companies. There's WeWork, which is the co-working space company. There's WeLive, which is a co-living venture. There's WeGrow, which is a conscious entrepreneurial school that they started. There's Rise by We, which is a complete wellness experience. And other than this, there are other V arms as well. And the way the company is structured is a spaghetti noodle ball of several companies, several holdings companies, and others coming together in various ways in various countries. WeWork also forayed into acquiring some smaller companies, in some cases, even technology focused companies, such as there was one company, I believe, which had to do with, opening and shutting down offices, a lock mechanism system based on software. And they also had joint ventures with services companies out there in terms of being able to provide services to their tenants. It's easy to see WeWork as a pretty risky real estate arbitrage play. What it does is it finds office spaces in hot markets, hopefully relatively cheap, in some cases not so cheap as well. So they take out long term leases and then they sublet back to other entrepreneurs, even if it's for short terms. It could be from days to months to weeks, whatever it is that they need. And they provide it even to the tune of providing a desk if needed, so that people could come in and use those spaces. The risky part of it is if the economy and when the economy stumbles, what will happen to all these spaces where they would still be liable for the leases to the landlords? They would still have to shell out the money whether the spaces are vacant or occupied. Playing devil's advocate here, we can also say that WeWork is more than a co working space company. It's about creating a community, a particular identity, not just renting space. That's where they started their journey when they actually began with their very first office. It was about providing services, free coffee, free beer, providing a place to play as well as work. And this appeals to the on demand mindset of a lot of startups, right? They can just walk in, hire a space, and then they have everything taken care of. And they just have to sit down and work on their venture. And they don't even have to lock themselves in a long term contract. So, what else do they need? They might be happy paying a little bit more for that kind of convenience than go and find a space where they're locked in for a longer term. At the same time, they're responsible for their own infrastructure, etc. WeWork lets companies retain this flexibility as they grow or shrink, or as their needs change over time. It may seem expensive, but it lets you, as a new entrepreneur or a startup, outsource the kinds of services that you require in order to run a dedicated office for your staff. So you could even play it that way. And actually, I think that's the differentiation that WeWork or any co working space should build upon. As in August 2019, when actually their IPO was going to go out, WeWork was valued at $47 billion, although it was losing money left, right, and center. Now, SoftBank CEO Masayoshi Son is the major investor in WeWork, and he's kind of a mentor. He's been a kind of a mentor to Newman and Rebecca, his wife, and we've read about it time and again. Son invested more than $10 billion in WeWork over the last 8+ years. In December, SoftBank was expected to invest another $16 billion in WeWork, but ended up not investing all of that, but only about $6 billion, with $1 billion of that going towards existing shares, which actually prompted renewed scrutiny of WeWork's business model, because there were investors in the Vision Fund that Son had formed who were questioning putting more money into a company like WeWork when it was losing money. And there were also people that were skeptical about it being just a real estate company and not a tech company as the CEO portrayed it. For now, WeWork just needs to convince private investors, including SoftBank, that it's not a bad deal. The time doesn't show that it is a good deal at this point. With SoftBank putting in more than $10 billion into WeWork, obviously it's not happy to see any of that value evaporate. They put in $10 billion at a $47 billion valuation, and it's important for SoftBank to see this through, because they're in the process of putting together their Vision Fund 2, and all the money into WeWork went in from Vision Fund 1, and they wanted to show a proper ROI on it as they were attracting investors into Vision Fund 2. That was one of the reasons why Son wanted the IPO to go through, so that they could show the return on investment on their investment from Vision Fund 1. However, that's not exactly what happened, which is basically the valuation was not where it was, the IPO got shelved, and now they're trying to ensure that their investment doesn't evaporate. And that's what SoftBank is working very closely with WeWork on. And they do want to go public at a later point in time, but after they've fixed all the issues. Now, WeWork is losing a couple of 100,000 every single hour. In 2018, their revenues doubled, so did their losses. to the tune of just being about 100,000 apart. They did about 1.8 billion in revenues and lost about 1.9 billion in 2018. So you can see that revenue and losses both doubled. And as of this year, in March, they were projected to have about 3 billion in revenues, but it already showed that about 700 million was lost in the first quarter of 2019. Adam Newman did a few things that were not scrutinized by the investors at any given point in time, and that was also a big issue for the IPO not going through. Now, the 9-year-old co-working space company decided to file its IPO back in December. That's when they filed it, and it was supposed to go to IPO in August as the We Company. That's what the new name that Adam Newman gave the company. But now, as I said, its IPO is shelved. So what really happened? As we look at this, let's kind of look at what exactly happened. So their IPO was supposed to go out in August. They needed to convince investors that it was a worthwhile investment, a long-term investment at that $50 billion or $47 billion valuation. And they also needed to convince investors that it would survive any economic downturns despite its losses. So when you look at this, August, they were supposed to have an IPO. In January of 2019, that was when the last 1 billion round happened, where SoftBank put in that 1 billion into WeWork at that 47 billion valuation, their total investment coming to roughly around 12 billion. And then in August, the S1 filing went in on August 14th. And the S1 filing is basically the document that went to the SEC to say, hey, here we are ready to go public. And then the scrutiny of SEC started happening. They started looking at the financials, they started looking at the operational practices, everything, and they started questioning a lot of these things. So what did they really question? They questioned the number of voting shares that Adam Newman had, which was about 1:20 for every share that they had outstanding. So they questioned that. They said, that's a questionable corporate governance practice. Although the company was growing to the tune of about 88 to 100% each year, they were burning through a lot of cash. So they were still a loss-making company, and very heavily so. They also questioned the CEO's wife having a say in who would lead the company should Newman die. They questioned that practice. They also questioned another thing that Newman had done. What he had done is he had registered We as a trademark in his own name, and then he sold it to WeWork for about roughly $6 million. They questioned that practice. One of the things that happened at that point in time was that Newman came back and said, he is willing to relinquish that. He's not really going to make the sale. So it was questioned as a practice, and that was his answer. And there were several other things. There were people that from his family that Newman had appointed in various positions. So there was questions about nepotism. There were also questions about some of his practices where he had actually taken loans from the company. There was, I think, a $7 million loan that he said he had paid back. But anyway, he took loans from the company. He went and bought real estate properties, and then he leased them back to WeWork. So he was double dipping or making money on the other side as well. So that practice was questioned as well. So there was a lot of questioning done, a lot of things that started showing up on that S1. And as a result, their valuation started dwindling. So from 47 odd million, it went down pretty quickly in about a week or so to 25 to 30 million. And then it still had the downward spiraling going on, at which point Sohn from SoftBank decided that they should not be going out for an IPO at this time, and he wanted it pulled. As a result, it was pulled. Initially, they said, hey, we're going to get it out by September. Now they have said it's not going to happen indefinitely. They had planned a road trip for the IPO to raise roughly between $4 to $8 billion. That was shelved as well as the valuation started to drop. Pressure from SoftBank made sure that the IPO was finally shelved. And now, as a result of a lot of these things coming out of the scrutiny, there are some regulatory changes happening. One is Newman's voting power was reduced. The stipulation that his wife could have a say in his replacement should he die, that was taken away. And then even Adam Newman was asked to step down. He was pressurized to step down, and he did step down as the CEO and became a non-executive chairman. At the same time, there were other things that came out. One of them being that he took to the tune of about $500 million in loans from various banks The collateral being his stock in the company, which they could have after the IPO. Now the IPO is not happening, so the stock really doesn't have as much value. So now the banks are working with him in order to find out and figure out ways of how to get their money back. And there are other things happening. Two new CEOs were appointed, Artie Minson and Sebastian Gunningham. They both were executives with WeWork, and they've been asked to step on board. And what they've done is they've started immediately looking at cost cutting. So there were also other practices that started showing up where the company was spending a lot of money. Adam Newman had a private plane that's being sold. There's also a laxity between work and play in terms of what Adam Newman encouraged that's coming out. There's also things showing that Adam Newman as a CEO was very idealistic and zany and wild in many cases. That's all coming out now. So one of the things that the two CEOs, the co-CEOs, did is they announced that they were going to have job cuts to the tune of about a third of the company's staff. Now, job cuts have been pretty prevalent in WeWork from time to time, pretty much every year, where they cut jobs and then they rehired, and they talked about how they were letting the bad performers go or the poor performers go, and they were hiring back again in order to spur the growth. The co-CEOs also announced that there's going to be a slowdown in terms of how the growth is going to happen, and all these other ancillary companies around WeWork that had been built, the focus is not going to be on them, but the focus is going to be on WeWork as a co-working space company. They also reached out to the employees, they reached out to the clients, apologized for all the issues that they had seen, and promised that they were going to double down and focus on the growth aspect. And we can see that they're already moving in that direction. One of them being WeWork launched in India a couple of months ago, and now they're looking at growing their market in India. Some of the recent acquisitions that WeWork had made in terms of some of the companies that they had bought, for instance, Meetup, they're looking at divesting most of them in terms of completely or probably a good enough stake so that they can focus on their core business that WeWork was put together for. So those are some of the things that we are seeing in terms of the changes that the co-CEOs are making. There are several questions that come up as a result of this. One of them is that the investors, when they put in so much money, why did they not have scrutiny or due diligence over how the management team was doing? They relied on this CEO who had never really held a proper job, so to speak, before at this level, and they relied on him to build this multi-billion-dollar company, and they didn't even scrutinize anything before they went and filed an S1, knowing that there was going to be due diligence and scrutiny at that point in time. So I think there's an onus, there's responsibility on the investors' end as well to have been on top of this, especially when they put in so much money in the company. Now the valuation, that's totally questionable too. You could say that, the investors and the entrepreneur sat in a private meeting, they decided to come up with the kind of valuation, but the substantiation of that valuation was far from where it should have been, and that did not happen either. So there you go. That's the other question that we have in terms of why was WeWork put up on the pedestal in terms of that valuation that crumbled so quickly once it met the public eye. When you look at gross margins of software companies, Facebook is in the range of about 80 to 85%. WeWork, on the other hand, has this big lug of real estate contracts that they're carrying that they're responsible for, whether they have empty offices or not. One of the things that the co-CEOs are going to do is also look at which markets they're doing well and which they're not, and look at finding ways and means of getting out of those contracts from buildings that they're not doing well. And really speaking, co-working spaces is not something new. We have companies like Regis who've been doing it for decades, and they've been doing it pretty well. So this was a different spin in terms of what Adam Newman put in terms of WeWork. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the media attention and the amount of money that was put into the company that just drove it up and up to be out there in the public eye all the time. And then I think the other thing is the private investors sitting together and deciding on what the valuation was going to be. So those are some of the issues I think we could all call out and say, what happened? What happened where you all agreed on a deal, and the moment it went and met the public eye, it just came crumbling down. There's also other issues that we could talk about. We could talk about Newman's extravagance, his practices, and how did he get all those hundreds of millions of dollars with which he did all these things in terms of buying buildings and leasing it back to the company, and why wasn't that questioned at the point in time that that happened. So it goes back to having a professional management team in place in terms of driving a company from where it is to that next level when you want it to become this multi-billion-dollar company. I think it kind of underscores the need for a professional executive team, professional management team, no matter what. So you could blame it on the founder, you could blame it on the investors, but I think everybody has something lacking in terms of oversight, in terms of self-dealing, and in terms of not keeping each other in healthy check at given points in time. So those are some of the things that could be questioned in this. And then the other things, when you really look at it, it's going back to the basics. Here's some unrequited advice to the co-CEOs that are going to run this company going forward. The reason WeWork got to where it was or built itself up was when it started with that very first office in New York, there was a focus on community, there was a focus on customers, there was a focus on customer service. I think that's where they can take a page out of Amazon's book in order to go back and refocus on that. It's time they refocus on their customers. There are several examples and stories out there where customers in WeWork offices don't feel cared for. There were times when they could talk to the executives directly. There were times when they could talk to customer service managers directly. Now it's difficult for them to find FaceTime with such folk. At the same time, if there's something broken in an office, now they're talking about how it takes several days before that's fixed. Whereas at a point in time, WeWork was all over it, on top of it, in order to provide the best of service. So I think WeWork is more than just a co-working spaces company. Their core business is customer service, and that's where they should focus. They should focus on service being their product, and that's where they can differentiate themselves, not just from competition, but in many ways. So they got to listen to their customers, they got to look into community building again and do things that are going to enhance the service, the returns that they can provide back to their clients, whether they're small startups or whether they're large companies. Irrespective of them being small startups or large companies, they can actually look at helping them out with their community building and enhancing the value that they can get from their deals with WeWork. Little things do matter, and I think customer service is the bottom line in terms of what can help them differentiate. Of course, they should look at cost cutting where it's not needed. Some of the extravagance can go. They should only focus on injecting cash where it's needed, only for growth. They should also focus on their core business of co-working spaces and how they can leverage that the best. They should focus on markets like India, for instance, where it's a burgeoning startup market, and there'll be a need for these kinds of services, especially where infrastructure is a challenge. And they can go in there and they can make a difference and they can grow. Those are the markets, the developing countries, that they need to look at in terms of getting the most bang for their buck. They should also look at doing different things with their clientele in terms of meeting them, surveys, customer interactions, things they can do in terms of gleaning from them as to what other services can they provide back to their customers. And that's where they should invest in terms of complementary things that they can do with co-working spaces so that they can grow other products and services and other realms of business in order to expand. So that's my unrequited advice to the new CEOs in terms of looking at WeWork as the company it is and turning it on its head to be a more profitable, more customer oriented company, growing it linearly the way it needs to grow, and then going out on an IPO. And that's when the market, the public market, will be happy to embrace it, happy to deal with a healthier WeWork. I hope you liked that episode. For more episodes like this and more content like this, please subscribe to Plan B Success Podcast on your favorite platform or go to www.planb.live. Thank you.